Good morning, everyone. I guess we can go ahead and get started. My name is Paul Krieger, and I'm here for the Who Cares, Why Bother? Real Writing for Real People series that they have going on in the English department. And I'm a professor of biology here, and I've been teaching here many, many years. And when I was your age, and I was actually a student here when it was GRCC, and when I was your age, I had no idea that I would eventually end up becoming an author. But it was here when I was a student where I started building the skills that I needed to have that happen one day. So what I'd like to do this morning is really talk to you about the process of how I became an author. I think that's the most valuable thing that you could gain from this. And then what I'll do is at the end, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take those. So if you have any thoughts about any questions you might like to ask, maybe you could just jot them down or keep them in mind. And at the end, I'll be asking people for questions and answers that we'll do at the very end, okay? So the title of my talk is How I Turned One Good Idea into a Book Series. So here's the idea that I'm talking about. This all started in the lab here at Grand Rapids Community College when I was teaching students. So the idea was what I refer to them as visual analogies. So let me give you a simple example so we can all understand what we're talking about. So I teach a lot of anatomy and physiology at GRCC, and students will learn things like the skeletal system. And let's say I have a student in lab, they're learning about the skeletal system. What I used to do many years ago, and this started about 14 years ago, was actually to, let's say they're working on a bone like this and they're looking at it in the lab. I used to draw little sketches to compare it to something from everyday life. So for example, in this case, what you're looking at the bottom is an example of what we call a thoracic vertebra. That's the ones, the vertebrae in your vertebral column that connect with ribs. And notice that each one of those looks like a giraffe head. So if you look at the illustration that I have here, and then you look at the giraffe head, you can actually superimpose what you know on what you don't know. And the way I used to teach it to students was I would say, oh, the snout of the giraffe is this thing called the spinous process. And oh, see the ears of the giraffe? Oh, the ears are called the transverse processes. And oh, see the horns? They're this structure, et cetera, et cetera. So by actually superimposing what you know on what you don't know, it's actually a documented form of learning called contextualized learning. So when you can put it in a context to something of everyday life, it makes a lot more sense, right? So some of these I created myself. Some of these visual analogies have been handed down from many instructors over the years. But one thing that I noticed is, I had heard some of these before, but one thing I noticed was nobody ever actually created a book where they showed the visual analogy with the actual anatomical structure like a bone. And so students gave me the comment in the lab. I would go around and draw these sketches to start with, and they say, hey, Mr. Krieger, these are really helpful. I'd really appreciate it, you know, if you keep doing this because it really helped me learn. So then it was actually my students who encouraged me and said, you should think about doing a book. And at first I just laughed it off and said, oh yeah, do a book, ha, ha, ha. I said, you really think so? And then over the years I started thinking and I said, boy, maybe it would be good to take all of the key study tips that I had created, take the mnemonics and the study tips and the visual analogies and combine it all together in like one activity book or workbook. And that basically was where the idea was born. It was actually born in the lab right here at GRCC. And again, that happened like 14 years ago. So that was the idea for the book. That was the origin of it. It came right out of my teaching experience here at school. So this is the cover of my first book. It's now in its 4th edition. And this is called A Visual Analogy Guide to Human Anatomy. And what you're looking at on the cover of this book is, this is the end of your humerus, which is the bone in your upper arm that goes toward your elbow joint. You're looking at the end that actually forms the elbow joint. And here's another visual analogy. Here's the actual bone with a photo of it. Here's an illustration. And we compare it to a hitchhiker's thumb. So somebody's sticking out their thumb, and the thumb is this part, and these two fingers are this part, and these two fingers are this part. So again, they're learning by visual analogies. Then if you look over here, this is actually a bone in your forearm, referred to as your radius. It goes toward the thumb side of your forearm. And the top of the radius looks like a hockey puck. So if we look at the top, it's really rounded, and so we have the analogy of a hockey puck for that. So we're just showing some of the visual analogies that a student would find inside the book. So if you want to take a look at one of the books after class, I bought, or after my presentation, I brought one with me today. And you can take a look at it and look through it and see what it's like. So I won't spend too much time talking about the format of the book. It's really meant to be several books in one. It's kind of a workbook. It's with key visual analogies. It's also a coloring book where students can color in and color code different parts. And it's also kind of like a summary of key points all combined into one. So that's the idea behind the book. So how many books in the series? I now have 4 books in the series. So remember, this started 14 years ago, a long time ago, right? And gradually I've been adding books in the series. So the first one was entitled, that's the cover that you just saw. It was A Visual Analogy Guide to Human Anatomy. And that one was 354 pages in total. That's the current edition page length for that one. The second book is A Visual Analogy Guide to Human Physiology. That one's 368 pages, and that one's now in its second edition. The third book is a combination of these two. So for example, here at community college all across the country and here at GRCC, we often combine the anatomy and physiology into one course. So we'll have a combined class. So by combining these two, that's my biggest book. That one's 594 pages, okay? So that one's combined anatomy and physiology. And then my fourth book is A Visual Analogy Guide to Chemistry. So the 3 topics that I'm really covering in this book series, as you can see, is anatomy and physiology and chemistry. So this has really developed into its own little enterprise. I actually have a registered business with this. So if you have questions about setting up a business, I have a sole proprietorship for this. If you have questions about how I became an author after I'm finished with this, feel free to ask any questions that you want. So if you look at that, that's kind of the process, and I should mention that the chemistry book is 304 pages. So that gives you an idea of how many books there are and the number of pages in each. So I just had a slide to show you the covers of the book. So you already saw that one. That was the first one I created, and I mentioned it's now in its 4th edition. This is the second book, the physiology book, showing an analogy on the front cover, just like we did here. So that one, again, 2nd edition. This one is the largest book, the Human Anatomy and Physiology. That one's currently in its 3rd edition. And then this is the Visual Analogy Guide to Chemistry, and the 2nd edition of that one just came out. That's like my most recent book. So 2nd edition of that one just came out. So that just gives you a quick cover shot of all the books in the series and kind of lets you know what it looks like and shows you some of the analogies that you would find inside. So a little bit about my interests. So obviously I like biology. That's the field, my chosen career. That's the field that I went into. So I was really kind of undecided. I always loved art and science as a kid, and ever since I was very young. And when I was a student here at GRCC, I actually was always trying to think of a way, how can I combine art and science? One of the things I thought about doing for a while was to go into the field of medical illustration. And I really love detail illustrations. I love doing that kind of artwork, and I also love science. So I thought, oh, that would be a really cool career. And they had a program at University of Michigan, so for quite a while I was thinking about doing that. So I've always loved biology, and I've always loved illustrating. And so I thought, how can I combine those two things? So I really chose the field of teaching because I thought that would be a really great way to combine those two things. And I've been very satisfied with that over the years because it really worked out well. That's 2 of my passions, and I was able to do that. Now, at the same time, I always enjoyed writing. Writing was something that didn't come natural to me. I always had to work at it. And it wasn't something that I just loved like I did biology and illustrating, but it was a skill that I had developed over the years, and with the help of a lot of teachers here and other places, I gradually got better at it and more confident in my writing. So I had skill sets in knowing about biology and writing and illustrating. So when students suggest to me, you should really think about writing a book, Mr. Krieger, then I really started to take it more seriously, because I said, well, this really fits into 3 things that I really enjoy doing. I think I might really like doing a book. So the first thing that I did, and this is what anyone will tell you who's thinking about being an author, they said, the first thing you should do is go out and see what's already out there. So that's what I did. I said, oh, I bet there's already a book that's already out there that has these visual analogies in it. I'll just order that for students and put it in the bookstore, and they can get that, and it'll be a real quick way to solve the problem, right? So then I don't have to draw sketches at the table. Well, I went out there and I didn't find anything, but that was 14 years ago, right? So I didn't find anything, so I thought, maybe the students were right. Maybe I should try to do a book. So then I started taking it a lot more seriously. Now I start talking to people who I know who are authors, and now I'm starting to really kind of pique my interest and really think this might be something that I want to do. So after encouragement from my students, I really took it seriously, and now I'm thinking about doing the book, but I have no idea how to become an author. I've never authored anything before, so now I have a lot of legwork to do. And so that's what I want to talk to you about. It's the legwork that's all the important stuff. So here's some important people that helped me in different ways, and sometimes I didn't realize it till much later. That's a picture of my father, Eugene Krieger, and that's a picture of my son. Ooh, that's a really old dated photo now, because my son is 16 years old now. He's halfway through high school and finishing his sophomore year. So my father was a Lutheran minister, and he passed away, God rest his soul, over 10 years ago now. And he was a really interesting guy. He was very much a very hard-working person. And he was always really dedicated to everyone, all his congregants in the church, and always would help people out whenever he could. So he set a really good example for me, not just being hardworking, but also having a good caring personality, and was compassionate for other people. But another thing that impressed on me that I didn't like when I was growing up in his household was he was a stickler for grammar. And he would be correcting my grammar all the time. And he always wanted to impress on me, there's a better way to say that. You're not saying it the right way. And at the time, I would roll my eyes. And when I was a kid, oh, there's Dad again, correcting my grammar. I didn't appreciate it till I got much older. And I realized, you know, he really made me think about what's the right way to say something. And he really made me conscious of language. And he also gave me an appreciation for vocabulary. He was always finding new words. He loved to find new words, loved to say, do you know the meaning of that word? Go look it up in the dictionary. Couldn't Google it back then, right? I had to do the hard work of looking it up in the dictionary. He would always have me go look it up. That really didn't impress on me very much how important that was when I was a kid, but later on thank you, Dad, when I was trying to become an author, because he helped me in numerous ways that I didn't even realize at the time. Another person was actually a professor that I had here, probably one of the best professors that I ever had. His name was Walt Lockwood. He's a retired professor from our English department here at GRCC, and he's a very talented person. He was not only a really great professor, but he was also a novelist, and he wrote screenplays, and he could have gone to Los Angeles and worked there, but he decided to stay here. When I was in his course, he was a really caring person, and I often had conversations with him outside of class. But what I really learned in his class was the process of writing. He didn't emphasize, just turn in your paper, your final paper, and you're done. He would make us do multiple drafts. So we had a first draft. Some of you may do this in your English courses here. He had a first draft, and then we peer critiqued it. He took all those home, marked them all up. We would go through like 3 revisions before we ever thought something was finished. So he taught me that the best writing is rewriting. And I'm sure you hear that from English professors all the time. You often don't get it right the first time. That's okay. Don't expect to get it right the first time. You know, you have to work on it. It's a skill. It takes practice. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. So Walt Lockwood was just a wonderful professor. And again, looking back, he helped me enormously to eventually becoming an author myself. So one of the key things I needed to do was find a mentor. I didn't know anything about authoring. I had never done this before. I needed to find someone else who had already done it so I could learn from them. So I was already the member of many professional organizations such as the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, which is a professional organization for teachers who teach in that field. And I had met a couple very important people that turned out to be mentors for me later. Here's the first person. His name is Mike Timmons. He was a textbook author and also a professor of biology. And he actually worked at a community college just outside of Chicago, not very far from here. He was a very successful author, wrote one of the best-selling anatomy books, and I met him at a conference. I was very impressed with his professionalism. And I started to pitch my ideas to different people, and I pitched my idea to him. And I'll never forget, one spring break, I just drove out to, their spring break at his community college was different than ours, and I just drove out and said, hey, Mike, I really have to talk to you about a book idea. I said, I want to do it face-to-face. I drove out, we sat down, and it was a wonderful experience. I pitched my idea to him. He just kind of looked at me like this, and he said, it's a great idea. That made me feel really good. Then he said, here's what it's going to be. He told me what it was going to be, and I hadn't envisioned what it was going to be. He said, this should be about 250 pages. It's going to be a softcover book. It's going to be a standalone supplement. He was saying some things I didn't even know what a standalone supplement was. You know, he was using lingo from the industry I didn't even know. What he did was he took my idea and turned it into a tangible reality. I didn't even know before. I couldn't envision what this was going to be. He told me what it was going to be. He said, make it a consumable, or it's a coloring book, or because that's unique and students like those things. And I said, great. So he crystallized my idea and turned it into a tangible reality. And that was a really important step for me at that time. Now I knew what I wanted to do. This person, Kevin Patton, was also a successful textbook author and a wonderful professor, award-winning professor of biology. I went to him, I pitched my idea, he said, it's a great idea. I'm even going to tell my editor about it, and when you go to one of these conferences, you can meet with her and pitch the idea. Wow, now I think things are really rolling along, things are going really well. Mike over here helped me crystallize my idea. Kevin's telling me, you know, giving me a personal contact, telling me who to talk to. This is all rolling along really, really well. Well, wasn't quite that easy. So getting published was a lot harder than I thought. I didn't think it was going to be that difficult, given my connections and talking to Kevin. I thought things were going to go really smoothly. They didn't. So what Kevin told me was selling your idea to an editor is going to be one of the toughest sales jobs you've ever done. And I said, why? He said, you're in the classroom. You know what works. You know where students, what really helps students and what really doesn't help students. You know in your gut, that works. Oh, that piece of technology is great. Oh, students love this. Students hate this. You know it in your gut. They don't have that experience. They don't know it. So you have to convince them, the non-teacher, that this is a good idea. And I found that that was absolutely true. It was incredibly difficult. They often would brush off my idea, not knowing that I knew that it was really effective in the classroom. So Kevin was absolutely right about this. Selling your idea to an editor at a publishing company is very, very hard, okay? The next thing is I started submitting proposals. And did I get an acceptance right away? Oh, no. I submitted a lot of proposals to big publishers like Pearson and Wiley, all these different ones, and I was getting rejection, 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 and it was getting depressing and very discouraging because I knew this was a good idea. I had it confirmed by people who were authors, but now the barrier was getting the publishing people to understand that it was good. So I had a lot of rejections, a whole lot of rejections. And I was getting to the point where I thought, maybe this isn't going to happen. So I had a really interesting experience that I'll share with you just to show you the reality of what goes on in like the publishing industry. So we want to sign you, or do we? Let me explain. So I had one editor who I gave a pitch to, I pitched my idea to with a fairly large publishing company. She said, I love this idea. You know what? After this conference, I'm going to come to Grand Rapids. We can meet at the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel. You can pitch your idea to me in detail. And I did that. I went over there. We sat down. I pitched the idea. I spent a lot of time making a really cool looking proposal. What I thought was a cool looking proposal. She loved the idea. She said, I'm going to sign this thing. And then I said, great, I'm finally going to get published after all those rejections. And then something really strange happened. After promising me she was going to sign, guess what happened? Never heard from her. A week went by, a month went by, 2 months went by, nothing. And then I was talking to some people who work in the industry, like intellectual property attorneys, and I said, why would somebody do something like this? It doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe I'm just green or naive. I don't know why they would do this. What possible reason would they have? They said, sometimes if they see a good idea, but they don't have any intent on signing it, they might stall it just so you can't have a competitor get the good idea. Get the good idea. So they said sometimes they'll do something just out of a defensive posture to not let somebody else get it. And I was just shocked by that. I thought, ooh, this is looking kind of like a difficult and sometimes, sometimes a dangerous industry. I didn't know it was going to be like that. And they said, oh yeah, it's very competitive and it's very challenging. So I learned a valuable lesson there. A verbal promise doesn't mean anything, right? Doesn't mean anything at all. So I suddenly came away with the idea, this is going to be much harder than I thought, right? I already put all this time in pitching the idea to all these different publishers, and I found out this is going to be really hard. I didn't realize it was going to be this hard, and I was getting pretty discouraged. I was almost ready to give up. So then I suddenly remembered something. I remembered this publisher. There was a real small publisher, not one of the big fish, but a small one, out of, they're located near Denver, Colorado, and they're called Morton Publishing. And we had used some of their products in class, and what we always liked about them, and you'll appreciate this, they were high quality materials, but they were inexpensive, right? So they kept their costs pretty low. And I said, I really like that idea. It's not really expensive, and they have really good, so I thought, they produced like photographic atlases and lab manuals. They didn't do textbooks like the big publishers, but they did more supplemental things in biology, and biology was probably like 75% of their business. So I thought, hey, this seems like a good fit. And so I suddenly realized I was making a big mistake. I was trying to pitch this to the big publishers, and the big publishers have a narrow view of what they want. And they were only interested in textbooks and things like that. They were not interested in things like mine that were supplements. So I learned you have to find the right fit for your product. Morton Publishing was already doing what are called standalone supplementals, which is what I was pitching. So I basically went over to them and I said, what do you think? I'm going to write a proposal. I went through it. They said, we're going to sign it. But it wasn't a verbal promise. They meant it. They saw it. They understood. They could see and envision how this would work. And finally, I had a publisher who was seriously interested in my product. Bottom line was, I finally was able to land a contract with Morton Publishing. And that was the beginning of this book series, and that was the beginning of my first book contract. So writing the book proposal is a big learning experience. When you go to write the book proposal, it's not like one generic form that everyone uses. Everybody has different ideas of what the proposal should be. So the first thing I learned was every publisher is different. Not everyone wants the same thing. So you have to know exactly what your publisher wants and what they expect from you in the proposal and just follow those instructions to the letter. So you need to do your homework to find out. Often you can go online and they'll tell you specifically they might have they might have new authors, and they might have a section like that on their website, and you might be able to go and find a template for what they expect you to write in your proposal. And tailor making it for them is going to show them that you're serious and you haven't just done a generic form letter, okay? Good writing skills are required, so obviously it's important not just in the book, but in your book proposal to write well and to be concise and to convey exactly what you mean and what your book's all about. So one of the things that I was encouraged to do by one of my mentors, Mike Timmons, was join a new organization I had not heard of before, and it was called the Text and Academic Authors, okay? So TAA for short, Text and Academic Authors. He said, Paul, you're gonna get so much out of this. Go to one of their conferences, become a member, it's not very expensive. So that's exactly what I did. I went online, I became a member, I looked when their conference was, and I attended the conference. And so here's some of the things I learned from TAA. The first thing I learned was the business end of publishing. So when you enter a contract with anyone, now you're looking at business lingo, and you need to know what's going on, and you need to understand how they work as a business. So that's very, very important. And most authors, when they go into it, they don't really have any idea about this. Even somebody who's really experienced, often this is the lowest thing on their priority list. They're worried about making a good book. They're not worried about the business end of publishing. TAA taught me about the business end of publishing. Another thing I was able to do was meet intellectual property attorneys. Believe it or not, there are attorneys who make a very good living simply doing things like helping people for a fee, to helping prospective authors to land contracts and things like that. So these intellectual property attorneys, I had never met them before, but they often attended the conferences so I could have conversations with them face to face. How did that help me? I was actually met a person who I ended up hiring, and I paid him a flat fee, and for that flat fee, he helped me negotiate my first contract. Looking back now, it was the smartest move I ever did. Smartest move I ever did, because he put things in there that I wouldn't even known about, like an audit clause, giving me the right to audit my publisher, to look at their books to see if what they're giving me is actually correct. So that was a really smart move. So I had no idea about that before I joined TAA. Another thing was I was able to network with other authors in different fields. So these people were in fields like not just science like me, but they were in, you know, criminal justice and English and all these different fields, business field, et cetera. So that allowed me to network with them. Another thing was they actually have people, believe it or not, who make a full-time living, just like you have accountants and things like that. Some accountants with an accounting background specialize in being an auditor. And they go in and they audit the books of the company to see if you're getting your just payment for the royalties that you would receive. So all of these things were really, really important. And then in addition to that, I was able to attend workshops on improving writing skills. So they had faculty members and members of the TAA who gave presentations on that. So for all these different reasons that you see here, it was really valuable for me to learn this right as I was about to land my first contract. Okay, so getting a contract offer. So congratulations, I got my first contract offer. Any author's excited about that. But the key thing you got to remember is don't sign your life away. Most prospective authors are so excited to get that first contract that they're just more than happy to just sign on the dotted line without looking over the contract. And the reality is that a contract is set up by lawyers who work for the publisher, and it's 80% in their favor most of the time and about 20% in favor of the author. So the contract is tilted way, way, way in favor of the publisher, which you would expect, right? Because they want to cover their interests. So your goal when you negotiate with them is actually to get it as close to 50-50 as you can. So negotiation, as I learned, is an art, but The key here is don't sign your life right away. They'll tell you, oh, this is our standard contract. There is no standard contract. Everything's negotiable. I learned that was very important to learn. Everything's negotiable. What they say is their standard will not be their standard if they want to sign you badly enough. Okay, so something I just kind of already gave a little bit of a preview of is negotiating a contract. So I learned a lot about negotiating a contract because I had my lawyer talking to my editor, and I saw the emails going back and forth, right? And I noticed one of the other presentations in this series was about business email, very important. And I think the message was, it's not a tax. If you never treat, what you guys should do right now when you're in school, get in the habit when you correspond with your professors and everybody else, get in the habit of doing business correspondence. Dear Professor Krieger, I am in this class at this time and I'm having a problem that I'd like to discuss with you. You treat everything very business-like. You're always going to make a better impression on people, and if you make it a habit now, it'll carry over later, right? If you do a short text-like message, it never looks good when it's in an email format. So I learned right away, when I saw my lawyer negotiating with my editor, one of the things he did was he was very polite. He would say, please consider this addition to the contract, and thank you for your consideration. So he was always did it in a non-threatening way when he was asking for a change in the contract. He was always very polite, but he was also very businesslike. Like, he made it very non-threatening, some of the changes that he proposed. So the negotiation part's a real art. And what I did was I let the lawyer negotiate the first contract. I learned so much from that, I didn't have to use him again when I negotiated later for another edition. I learned from what he did, I paid close attention, then I said, I can do it myself. Remember that you're not gonna get everything you want, but if you don't ask for anything, you'll never have any gains in your contract. So again, it's a negotiation, it's a back and forth, and so they kept going back and forth, back and forth. Oh, we'd like an audit clause. Oh, we'd like this. Oh, we'd like that. And sometimes my editor said, fine. Sometimes he said, I don't think so. And they kept going back and forth for months. And it's a slow process, but you have to be patient and give it time. And if you do, you'll end up with something much, much better in the end. Another thing that a lot of authors don't realize is if you're in the academic arena like me, each new edition offers a negotiation opportunity. So you don't have to feel like you have to get it all in the first contract negotiation. You can actually come back later and you can say, oh, you know, that first edition was so successful, I think I'd like to have this and this. Would you please add that? Now I'm to the point where I can just ask for a few extra things and they'll typically give it to me. We don't even have to spend much time negotiating. So if the book is doing well, it's going to give you more leveraging power for a negotiating opportunity. Okay, so writing and illustrating the book. So I had to illustrate this book. This is not very typical. Usually if you're doing like a textbook, you'll have an author and you'll have an illustrator. They're totally separate, different people. They're not combined into one. So my situation was kind of unique. So this is one of the first questions my editor from Morton Publishing asked me. He said, well, you can create all the illustrations digitally, right? And I said, yeah, I knew that's what they wanted. I really wasn't prepared for that. I said, sure, not knowing that I had to do everything in Adobe Illustrator. And you know, I don't know if you guys are familiar with like people who work with doing digital illustration, but they work like on a tablet, right? And they use a pen. So that's the smart way to do it. I wasn't that smart. I didn't know how to use a tablet. I didn't know how to use a pen. I didn't even know anything about Adobe Illustrator. But I said, sure, I can create it all digitally. So guess how I did all the illustrations for all those pages? Optical mouse with a cramping right hand. That's what got me through. I actually created them all with a mouse. I don't know if you've ever tried that before. These are a lot of line drawings, but that's how I did it. It's an arduous process. I wouldn't recommend that anybody do it that way. This is kind of like the the dumb way to do things for illustration, but again, live and learn, right? Then later I learned a tablet and things became easier, but that was the first question that I got. And I wasn't prepared for that. Then I had to force myself to learn Illustrator. I already mentioned that the best writing is rewriting. Walt Lockwood taught me that, a professor here. And when you're in the process of writing the book, you realize it's not going to all come out well the first time, and that's okay. And you allow yourself to go through the constant rewriting process, which is time-consuming, but it helps. You're never going to get it right the first time, as I just mentioned a moment ago, so don't expect to. I think a lot of students especially get frustrated, like, oh, I should have that paper just perfect the first time I write the first draft. Now, that's not normal. Even really good authors don't get it right the first time, so recognize that and just cut yourself some slack when you're working on a big project. And then, how long is it going to take? So this is a common question. So my first book, so this is 14 years ago, my first book, that was the Visual Guide to Human Anatomy. It took 2.5 years. So it's not easy. I was already working a full-time job. I was a father of a 2-year-old son at the time. And now time management, as I'll be pointing out, becomes a big issue. So how do you do this? I would do it on evenings, weekends, summers. I had to really budget my time really, really well. So when I'm working on this book for 2.5 years, there's no guarantee of success. It could have just flopped, you know, and I would think, oh man, was that 2.5 years down the drain? But you know what? Even if it wasn't successful, I wouldn't have viewed it as time down the drain because I learned a lot of skills. I learned how to work in Adobe Illustrator. I learned how to write better. I learned a lot of really good skills that I could apply to a lot of other situations. So even if the book wasn't successful, it was a successful experience for me. So only about 17% of first editions in like the academic arena make it into a second edition. So the odds are kind of stacked against you. It really needs to be successful in order for you to even get to make a second edition. If you don't have a successful first edition, that book just disappears, and that's the norm. It might come out, and then it's gone. I already mentioned time management. I had to be a super good time manager, and I had to budget my time, and I had to put things into little chunks. So this is super important, breaking up the project into smaller pieces. So I'm looking at a project that's going to take 2.5 years. But if you start to break it up in not just what am I going to do the first year, but what am I going to do this month? No, what am I going to do this week? No, what am I going to do this day? You suddenly realize when you break it up into real small pieces, hey, even though this is a 2.5-year project, it's very achievable because now I realize, oh, I need an hour on this night, and I have to consistently do it for 2.5 years, but it's going to happen. When you break a huge, intimidating project up into smaller pieces, it's much more approachable, much less intimidating, and you really feel like, I can get this done. So that was really, really important. Okay, and the last slide I had was just to mention the learning never stops. Even now, I've had 4 books, and I've had many new editions, and I'm still learning things like the changing publishing industry. I'm learning skills like things like new digital skills, not just in Illustrator, but Photoshop and other things. And so it's really a lifelong learning process when you're becoming an author. So that's something that is important to mention too, because it's not just you finish the book and it's done and you walk away. You're always working on something new. I'm always editing. I'm always thinking of new ideas. I'm soliciting feedback from students. I'm getting input from reviewers who have reviewed the book for new ideas. So it's really true that the learning never stops. So that's all I have for my presentation today. So thanks very much for listening. If anybody has any questions of any kind that they'd like to ask, I'll be happy to answer them. Nothing? Okay, thanks very much. Have a good day.